Welcome, dear friends, to a heart-wrenching tale of loss, love, and unexpected miracles. Enjoy the story. 5-year-old Emily looked up at her older sister with wide, hopeful eyes. Her blonde pigtails bounced as she tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Are you going to bring me candy from Grandma Olivia and Grandma Diane?" 10-year-old Sarah gazed at her little sister and sighed softly, her heart heavy with the weight of her secret. Of course she would. How could she not? But Sarah would never tell Emily the truth about where those sweets really came from. The local cemetery was hardly a place for candy shopping, but grief had a way of softening hearts. The mourners there were always quick to offer treats to the quiet girl who snuck away from the nearby orphanage. "Sure thing, Em," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "You know they always send the best candy." Emily clapped her hands in delight. "Yay! I hope they send those yummy chocolate bars again. Do you think they will?" Sarah ruffled her sister's hair. "We'll just have to wait and see, won't we?" As Emily skipped off to play with her worn teddy bear, a last gift from their parents, Sarah's smile faded. She hated lying to her sister, but what choice did she have? The truth was too harsh for Emily's young ears. Sarah and Emily had only been in the orphanage for a year, ever since that day when their parents' lives were cut short in a horrific car crash. They still had a grandmother on their mom's side, but she was too ill to care for them. Rumors swirled that Grandma Olivia wasn't quite right in the head anymore. As for Grandma Diane, their dad's mother, she lived comfortably and was relatively young, barely past 50. Sarah clung to the hope that someday Grandma Diane would take them in. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, that hope grew dimmer. Sarah often lay awake at night, listening to the soft snores of the other girls in the dormitory, wondering why their family had abandoned them. Sarah's mind drifted back to that gut-wrenching day of her parents' funeral. The memory was so vivid, she could almost smell the sickly sweet scent of lilies and feel the scratchy fabric of her black dress against her skin. With tears streaming down her face, she had approached Grandma Diane, wrapping her arms around the older woman's waist. The fabric of Grandma Diane's expensive suit was smooth under Sarah's cheek, a stark contrast to the roughness of her own discount store dress. "Grandma, please take us in. Me and Emily," Sarah had pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. She looked up into Grandma Diane's face, searching for any sign of warmth or compassion. "I promise I'll grow up fast and start earning money. I'll do everything around the house and take care of Emily too. Just please don't abandon us." Grandma Diane, tall and youthful-looking in her elegant black suit, had given what seemed like a smile, but Sarah felt an immediate chill. She knew, right then, that rejection was coming. "Sarah, darling, listen," Grandma Diane had said, her voice syrupy sweet, but devoid of warmth. She placed her manicured hands on Sarah's shoulders, holding her at arm's length. "I know this is hard, but you have to understand. Your parents never managed to pay off their mortgage. If you girls go into the system, at least you'll be guaranteed apartments from the state when you're older. You might think I'm being cruel now, but one day, you'll thank me." Sarah had wanted to scream that she didn't care about some future apartment. All she needed was for someone, anyone, to hold her and love her, even just a little bit. She wanted to tell Grandma Diane how terrified she was, how she had no one to turn to, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched helplessly as Grandma Diane turned away, linking arms with a younger man, her new husband, Robert. As they walked away, Sarah heard Robert mutter, "Good riddance. We don't need any brats cramping our style." Sarah's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. How could Grandma Diane choose this cruel man over her own grandchildren? Later that night, as Sarah tucked Emily into bed at the orphanage, the younger girl asked innocently, "Sarah, where did Mommy and Daddy go?" Sarah's heart clenched. She remembered what Grandma Olivia had told her, a strange explanation that Sarah didn't quite believe herself, but it seemed to comfort Emily. "They became angels, sweetie," Sarah said softly, smoothing Emily's hair. The little girl's eyes were wide and trusting, hanging on her every word. "We shouldn't cry because they're happy now. They're watching over us every second, making sure we're okay." Emily's eyes widened even further. "Really? They can see us right now?" Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. That's right. And they're so proud of what a brave girl you're being. But if they're angels, Emily said, her brow furrowing in confusion, why can't they come visit us? Don't angels have wings? Sarah's mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation that would satisfy her curious sister. Well, you see, they have very important angel duties. They can't always be visible to us, but they're always here. She placed a hand over Emily's heart. Right here, watching over us. Emily seemed to accept this, nodding solemnly. I miss them, Sarah, she whispered, her lower lip trembling. Sarah pulled her sister into a tight hug, blinking back her own tears. I miss them too, Em, but we've got each other, right? And that's what matters most. As Emily drifted off to sleep, Sarah allowed herself a moment of weakness, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She couldn't let herself break down, not when Emily needed her to be strong. But in the quiet darkness of the dormitory, surrounded by the soft breathing of other orphaned children, Sarah felt more alone than ever. Sarah's mind wandered back to a conversation she'd overheard between her parents just days before the accident. They had been whispering in the kitchen, thinking the girls were asleep. Sarah had crept down the stairs, drawn by the urgency in their voices. Mark, we can't keep up with the mortgage payments, her mother, Lisa, had said, her voice tight with worry. Sarah peeked around the corner, seeing her mother's face illuminated by the harsh kitchen lights. Lisa looked older than Sarah had ever seen her, lines of stress etched deeply around her eyes and mouth. We might have to give up the house, Lisa continued, running a hand through her disheveled hair. Even then, we'll still be in debt. The girls will be nearly 30 by the time we can provide them with their own place. Her father had sighed heavily, the sound seeming to come from the depths of his soul. He was hunched over the kitchen table, bills spread out before him like a landscape of despair. I know, Lisa. I've even asked my dad, but he says he already left me everything. If I was dumb enough to sign it all over to Mom, that's my problem. He's got his new family now, doesn't even care about his granddaughters. Sarah's heart had clenched at the defeat in her father's voice. She'd never heard him sound so broken. What about your mother? Lisa had asked, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. Surely Diane could help, even a little. She's always going on about how well off she is now. Mark's laugh had been bitter, startling in its harshness. You know how she is now, with that new husband of hers. Says she has her own life, not a boarding house. God, I don't even recognize her anymore. There was a moment of heavy silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Then Lisa spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. What are we going to do, Mark? How are we going to take care of our girls? Sarah had crept back to her room then, her young heart heavy with a worry no child should have to bear. She climbed into bed beside Emily, who was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing around them. As Sarah lay there in the darkness, she made a silent vow. No matter what happened, she would protect Emily. She would be strong for both of them. 3 days later, Mark and Lisa had set out to inquire about a job opportunity in a nearby town, one that offered temporary housing. They never made it there. Sarah remembered that day with painful clarity. It had started like any other breakfast around the kitchen table, Emily chattering excitedly about a picture she'd drawn in school, their parents exchanging tired but affectionate smiles over their coffee cups. We'll be back before dinner, Lisa had promised, kissing both girls on the forehead. Be good for Mrs. Johnson next door, okay? Can we have pizza for dinner? Emily had asked, her eyes shining with hope. Mark had laughed, ruffling Emily's hair. We'll see, Pumpkin. Maybe if you're extra good today? Those were the last words Sarah ever heard her father say. The afternoon had dragged on, the hands of the clock moving with agonizing slowness. Sarah had tried to distract Emily with games and stories, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then came the knock on the door. Sarah remembered the police officers at the door, their faces grim beneath their caps. She remembered the social worker with her plasticky smile, explaining that she and Emily would be going to a nice place with other children. She remembered Emily's screams as they were led away from the only home they'd ever known. No, I want Mommy and Daddy, Emily had wailed, her small body racked with sobs. Sarah had held her sister tightly, trying to be strong even as her own world crumbled around her. And she remembered the deafening silence of Grandma Diane and Grandma Olivia in the days and weeks that followed. Not a single visit, not a phone call, nothing. It was as if Sarah and Emily had ceased to exist the moment their parents died. As they settled into their new life at the orphanage, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, had their grandmothers forgotten about them entirely? Or did they simply not care? Months passed, and life at the orphanage fell into a routine. Wake up, breakfast, school, homework, dinner, bed. Rinse and repeat. Sarah threw herself into her studies, determined to make her parents proud wherever they were. She looked after Emily as best she could, shielding her from the harsher realities of their new life. But Emily, young as she was perceptive. She noticed the other children receiving visits from relatives, watched as some were even adopted and taken to new homes. One night, as Sarah was tucking her into bed, Emily asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "Why don't Grandma Olivia and Grandma Diane just come get us?" Emily asked, her little face scrunched up in confusion. "Don't they love us anymore?" Sarah's mind raced, searching for an explanation that wouldn't break her sister's heart. She thought quickly, drawing on all the fairy tales and stories she'd read. "Well, you see," she began, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "They're both fighting over who gets to take us. They both want us so much they can't agree." Emily's eyes widened in wonder. "Really? They both want us that bad?" Sarah nodded solemnly, warming to her tale. "Oh yes, Grandma Olivia says she should take us because she makes the best cookies. But Grandma Diane says she should have us because she has a big house with a swimming pool." "Wow," Emily breathed, clearly captivated by this imaginary scenario. "But why can't we just live with both of them?" "Well," Sarah said, thinking fast, "they live in different states. So if we lived with both of them, we'd have to be split up. You don't want that, right?" Emily's face paled at the thought. "No, never. I want to stay with you forever and ever." Sarah pulled her sister into a tight hug, relief flooding through her. "Then we have to wait until they decide," she said. "But don't worry. They love us so much they're sending us candy all the time, remember?" Emily nodded, her fears apparently assuaged. "I hope they decide soon," she murmured as she snuggled into her thin orphanage blanket. "I miss having a real home." "Me too, Em," Sarah whispered, her heart heavy. "Me too." But as she lay in her own bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling of the orphanage dormitory, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how long she could keep up this charade. How long before Emily realized the truth, that their grandmothers had abandoned them just like everyone else. That weekend, like so many before, Sarah snuck out of the orphanage and made her way to the cemetery. The cool morning air nipped at her cheeks as she slipped through the iron gates, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Today, luck was on her side. A large crowd had gathered for what appeared to be a rather grand funeral. Expensive cars lined the paths, and well-dressed mourners milled about, their hushed conversations creating a low hum in the air. Perfect, Sarah thought, her eyes scanning the crowd. Rich people always have the best candy. She approached a man in an expensive suit, who seemed to be in charge of unloading the coffin. His back was to her as he directed the pallbearers. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Excuse me, sir?" she said, her voice small but clear. "Would you happen to have any candy?" The man turned and Sarah's heart plummeted. It was him, Robert, Grandma Diane's new husband, the one with the sly, cruel eyes. He was wearing a mask of grief, but Sarah could see the excitement dancing behind his eyes. Robert's lip curled in disgust as he recognized her. "You!" he spat. "What are you doing here? This is a private funeral." Sarah stood her ground, though her knees felt weak. I just wanted some candy, sir, for my sister." Robert glared at her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and thrust a handful of wrapped sweets at her. "Here, take your candy and get out of here," he snapped. "Where are your parents, anyway? Or did that useless orphanage let you escape?" Sarah clutched the candy tightly, her eyes darting to the coffin behind Robert. A terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. They're nearby, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Could it be? Was Grandma Diane in there? Despite everything, Sarah felt a pang of sadness. Grandma Diane might have been unkind, but she was still family, and Sarah remembered her dad mentioning once that Grandma suffered from epilepsy. There had even been a time, years ago, when they thought she had died, but it turned out she had just taken too much medication. Sarah's hand closed around the small mirror in her pocket, a final gift from her mother. It had a beautiful rose etched on the case and opened like a compact. She had to know for sure. Taking a deep breath, Sarah spoke up, her voice louder and clearer than before. "Thank you for the candy, kind grandmother," she said, drawing curious looks from the nearby mourners. "May I kiss her forehead to say thank you?" The adults exchanged bewildered glances, murmuring among themselves, but no one objected. To Sarah's surprise, a kindly-looking woman even lifted her up so she could reach into the open part of the coffin. As Sarah leaned over the coffin, she caught a glimpse of Grandma Diane's face. She looked peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping. But there was something off about her color, a faint bluish tinge to her lips that made Sarah's heart race. Sarah saw Robert's face contort with anger from the corner of her eye. He started forward, shouting, "Why should I have to put up with some brat? That's my wife in there!" But an older man Sarah had never seen before held him back. This stranger had salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that reminded Sarah painfully of her father. "She's my wife too, ex-wife anyway," the man said firmly. "So cool it, she's just a kid." Sarah realized with a start that this must be her real grandfather, her dad's father. Silently, she thanked him for the intervention. Quickly, Sarah pulled out her mirror and held it to Grandma Diane's lips. Her heart raced as she watched, hardly daring to breathe herself. 1 second passed, then 2, then... there it was, the faintest trace of mist on the glass. Grandma Diane was alive. "Grandpa Dennis!" Sarah cried out, not quite sure why she was addressing this stranger she'd never met before, but something in her heart told her he would help. "Look, she's breathing!" The crowd around the coffin erupted into chaos. Some people gasped in shock, others began to pray, and a few even fainted dramatically onto the manicured cemetery lawn. "What nonsense is this?" Robert roared, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. He tried to push past Dennis, his eyes wild with a mixture of anger and... was that fear? But Dennis, drawing on years of experience as an ER doctor, shouldered him aside. "I'm a doctor," he announced to the stunned crowd. "Everyone, please step back and give us some space." Dennis leaned over the coffin, pressing his fingers to Diane's neck. His eyes widened. "There's a pulse," he said, his voice filled with disbelief and hope. "It's faint, but it's there." As Dennis called for an ambulance, Sarah watched Robert grow increasingly agitated. He paced back and forth, muttering about ruined funeral plans and wasted money. In that moment, Sarah knew. He had tried to bury Grandma Diane alive. The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics arrived, whisking Grandma Diane away to the hospital. Police officers appeared, asking questions that Sarah couldn't quite follow. Through it all, Dennis kept a protective arm around Sarah's shoulders, shielding her from the chaos. "You're a very brave and smart girl," he told her as they waited at the hospital. "Your father would be proud." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You knew my dad?" Dennis nodded, a sad smile on his face. "I did. And I'm sorry I wasn't there for him, or for you girls, but I promise that's going to change." 2 months later, Sarah and Emily stood in the doorway of a beautiful house, their small suitcases at their feet. Grandma Diane, looking years younger and infinitely kinder, knelt down to hug them both. "Welcome home, my darlings," she said, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything. Can you ever forgive me?" Emily looked up at her, confusion evident on her little face. "Did you win the fight with Grandma Olivia? Sarah said you were fighting over who got to keep us." Sarah froze, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, but Grandma Diane just winked at her and said, "Oh yes, and it wasn't easy, but you're both worth it." Later, when Emily was distracted by her new room, Grandma Diane pulled Sarah aside. "I owe you an apology, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That day at the funeral, I was a different person then, cruel and selfish. Robert, my ex-husband, he'd been slowly poisoning me, hoping to inherit everything. If you hadn't been there that day—" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her dad had always insisted that his mom wasn't really bad, just unhappy. Maybe he'd been right after all. "But that's all in the past now," Grandma Diane continued, squeezing Sarah's hand. "Thanks to you, I've been given a second chance, and I promise I'm going to spend every day making it up to you and Emily." As the weeks passed, Sarah and Emily settled into their new life. The big house that had once seemed so intimidating became a warm, loving home. Grandma Diane doted on them, always ready with a hug or a word of encouragement, and Grandpa Dennis, as the girls had come to call him, was a constant source of support and laughter. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah helped Grandma Diane in the kitchen, she couldn't help but marvel at the change in her grandmother. Gone was the cold, distant woman from the funeral. In her place was someone warm and nurturing, someone who hummed as she baked cookies and asked about Sarah's day at school. "Grandma," Sarah said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Diane turned from the oven, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, sweetheart, you can ask me anything." Sarah took a deep breath. Why didn't you want us before? When Mom and Dad died?" Diane's face fell, and for a moment, Sarah regretted asking. But then her grandmother sat down at the kitchen table, patting the seat beside her. "It's a fair question," Diane said as Sarah sat down, "and you deserve an honest answer." She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "The truth is, I was lost for a long time. After your grandfather and I divorced, I felt like I had failed at everything, being a wife, being a mother. So I tried to reinvent myself. I thought if I could be young and carefree again, I could be happy." She shook her head, a rueful smile on her face. "But all I did was push away the people who really mattered. I was so caught up in my own pain that I couldn't see anyone else's, not even my own grandchildren's." Sarah listened, her heart aching for the pain she heard in her grandmother's voice. "When Robert came along," Diane continued, "I thought he was my chance at a fresh start. But he was just using me for my money. He isolated me from everyone, made me dependent on him. By the time your parents died, I was too far gone to see what really mattered." She reached out, taking Sarah's hand in hers. "But that day in the cemetery, when I opened my eyes and saw you there, it was like waking up from a long, terrible dream. I realized what I'd thrown away, and I knew I had to make it right." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm glad you woke up," she whispered. Diane pulled her into a tight hug. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." As the months passed, the Watson family grew stronger. Grandma Diane remarried to Dennis, Sarah, and Emily's grandfather. It turned out he'd never had another family. Those had just been rumors he'd spread to make himself seem happier than he was. Sarah watched as her grandparents became the loving parents she and Emily so desperately needed. Sometimes she wondered if Grandma Diane really had died that day in the cemetery, if the woman who came back was someone new, someone kinder and more loving. She never shared these thoughts with anyone. Emily was too young to know the full story of that day in the graveyard. And Sarah had learned an important lesson. Sometimes, life had to hit people very hard over the head with a metaphorical sledgehammer before they learned to live like decent human beings. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Emily suddenly asked, "Do you think Mom and Dad can see us now? From heaven?" A hush fell over the table. Sarah held her breath, unsure how her grandparents would react. But to her surprise, Grandpa Dennis smiled gently. "I'm sure they can," he said, "and I bet they're very proud of both of you." Grandma Diane nodded in agreement. "Your parents were wonderful people," she added, "and while they can't be here with us physically, I know their love for you girls is still very much alive." As she watched Emily's face light up with joy, Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe Mom and Dad really had become angels that day. How else could she explain the miracle that had brought them all together? Later that night, as Sarah stood on the back porch, looking up at the stars, She felt a sense of peace wash over her. The past year had been filled with more pain and loss than any child should have to bear, but it had also brought unexpected blessings. She thought of Emily, sleeping soundly in her new room, of Grandma Diane, who had found the strength to change and become the grandmother they needed, of Grandpa Dennis, who had stepped up to be the father figure they'd been missing. And she thought of her parents. Wherever they were, Sarah hoped they could see the family that had formed in their absence. She hoped they were proud. With a contented sigh, Sarah turned and went back into the house, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the warm light of their future. The road ahead might not always be easy, but they would face it together, as a family.